Good evening. Thank you for joining us for our third and final session of the Dimensions of Jewish Ethics series. I'm Dr. Shira Weiss of the Sacks-Herenstein Center, and over the past 2 weeks, David Shatz has explored the ethics of human decision-making and the problem of evil, topics with great relevance to the world's current state of affairs. And tonight's session on the ethics of sacrificing oneself for others brings up contemporary questions as well. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks discusses the concept of altruism in his book, Morality, and he writes, in short, as soon as we exercise our moral sense in terms of helping others in particular, we gain enormous benefits, not just psychological, but physical. It's as if we realign ourselves with deeply engraved instincts that have somehow become underused in a world of self-esteem, self-satisfaction, and self-preoccupation. The benefits are real, measurable, and lasting. We have material needs, and they are important. But we also have psychological, spiritual, and moral needs, and they too are important. Once our basic needs for sustenance and security have been met, we're more enriched by what we give than by what we receive. But the question arises whether self-sacrifice is a necessary part of morality. To what extent do we have to act altruistically? And how are we to understand the ethics of sacrificing oneself for others? Now, to address these questions, we turn to Dr. Shatz.
Hey, thank you very much, Shira. This is my third session here, so I guess you could call it the Chazaras Shatz. I'm back, but that's not as good as a line that I heard Rabbi Sacks had. I couldn't find it on the internet, but supposedly he said after he spoke somewhere he had been before, and he came back and he said, this is the second coming of the Lord. So we got two jokes to go there. Okay, my topic tonight is basically, as you saw in Shira's quote, altruism. Altruism, giving up your own interests for the sake of other people. Now, the truth is there's a difference between altruistic behavior and altruistic motivation. I mean, lots of people can act in a way that seems altruistic, seems that they're interested in helping people, but they really have deeper motives. In fact, this search for deeper motives has led to a lot of skepticism among philosophers, and on the source sheet I have a number of quotes to that effect to show that. But they believe that really people ultimately are only interested in promoting their own self-interest, no matter how altruistic the act may look. Example, charity. Right? One theory about charity. I'll give you a few theories about charity. Why do people give charity? Well, they give charity because they want to go to heaven, or they give charity because they want to be honored, or they give charity because they want to exercise power over people. And so that's a kind of cynical interpretation. In the literature, they refer to this as reinterpreting motives. And there are other examples like this. For example, look at the sheet under Nietzsche, the quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, the slave morality is the morality of utility. Now, what does that mean? Nietzsche believed that there are these ethical codes that people have concocted, he said. I don't think he had Christianity in mind with this, where the ethic stresses sympathy and kindness and so forth. Says, why do people come up with that kind of ethical code? Well, they come up with it because they're weak, they're soft, it's to their advantage. That's another example of this kind of reinterpretation of motive. Now, I have to say that I am sort of puzzled by a number of aspects of this cynical approach. First of all, a lot of the people who hold this also have very strong positions about what is right and what is wrong to do. But if they really think that all of this is not based, none of this is really based on altruism, so then they're asking people to do things that they really can't be responsible for. Because if all you can do is act altruistically, then everything that you do is something that where you couldn't act out of truly altruistic motivation. So where is the responsibility? If all you can do is to act unaltruistically, in other words, to have deep down have these non-altruistic motivations. A second point is I wonder why sometimes people are so gleeful in presenting this sort of view. In other words, in presenting the idea that none of us ever really are altruistic. What's so happy about it? I mean, aren't you casting aspersions on yourself if you say that? Reminded of something Rabbi Norman Lansdale uh, wrote about materialism, about the idea that all human beings are really clumps of matter. He said, "Boy, people are very happy to be saying that sort of thing. Why is that?" I mean, he found it to be very peculiar. So I think that there are some questions that can be asked about this whole approach, or at least there is, I think, a deep inconsistency in the way people handle these questions. But in any case, I do want to talk about the first question that I have there, which is the question of whether altruism truly exists, and we see what the issue is. So I want to make a couple of points about this. First of all, I want to point out that the thinking about this has been affected I think, in a good direction by studies of Holocaust rescue. Holocaust rescuers are people who uh, gave up, who sacrificed enormously, did things at enormous risk to save Jews. I first came across this in an article, in a book rather, by Samuel Olener and Pearl Olener, who were Holocaust survivors, where they studied survivors by interviewing them and spoke about the people they had rescued. They spoke to the people they had rescued, and they put together explanations of why people rescued. And some of the people did it because they had been taught certain rules at home. Some did it because they had developed some moral theory on their own. Most of the people who were rescuers did it out of empathy, but it seems that this really kind of gives the lie to the idea that nobody ever acts out of anything but self-interest. One of many examples. Obviously, many other examples have been proposed, countless other examples, and you usually get the same kind of answer from the skeptics about altruism. But in this case, I think you have a pretty strong case. Take a look, just if you can put the sheet back on. I'll show you just an article. This is not from the Olener book, but this is from an article in a philosophical journal. I was very happy to see this. This is back in 1990. This is the leading specialty journal in ethics. And it speaks about, first paragraph talks about the rescuers made little or no conscious decision. And then the second paragraph is really trying to say, look, there are all kinds of reasons that have been given by those who think people always act out of self-interest. They're given all kinds of reasons why people engage in Holocaust rescue. And there's a long list, as you see in the second paragraph: cost-benefit calculus, psychic gratifications, expectations of reward. And basically, look at the next sentence. Our analysis suggests that none of these explanations adequately accounts for rescue behavior. And therefore, they believe, I'll just take the first of the three things they mentioned, we conclude that there are definite limitations to any theory which makes self-interest the norm of human behavior. I think that the emergence of the Holocaust rescue cases has really been very telling. Now, I also want to discuss a number of other things, though, that fall under this. One thing that often comes up is empathy, which you hear endlessly about. But the truth is, empathy has now sort of come a little bit upon hard times, at least among philosophers, and there are a few reasons for this. One is the fact that empathy involves you putting yourself in the other person's shoes. And so to some extent, what you are doing when you feel an unpleasant feeling, when you put yourself in someone else's shoes and you feel bad about them, is to some extent you're reflecting that back on yourself. This is one sort of reservation people have. But other reservations is that when people are up close to you, you feel empathy, but you're not going to feel that for the larger world. Now we're going to come back to this question, I hope, at the very end, the question of the significance of sort of local context in which you encounter people and global issues. But those who are most interested in sort of global altruism will not be very impressed by empathy, and in fact, they are not. A point's been made that people sometimes dispose more positively to people who are attractive than people who are unattractive, and so on and so forth. One other point to mention here in connection with this empirical question, in other words, the scientific question of whether people are actually being empathetic, is some discoveries they've made in the social sciences. Now, these are somewhat amusing, but the point will be that people sometimes don't realize the real reasons why they're acting ethically. There was an experiment done in the 70s, back when there was this thing called the phone booth. You may have heard of it. That's where you'll find Clark Kent occasionally changing into Superman. Some people got it in the experiment. Some people got a dime back from the phone booth, and some people did not get a dime back from the phone booth. Those people who got a dime back from the phone booth, both of them encountered some people who would drop papers. And in the experiments, when people got a dime back from the phone booth, they were much more likely to help the person who dropped the papers than they were if they didn't get a dime back. Now listen to these numbers. The people who helped pick up the papers because when they had gotten a dime back, 6 out of 7 did that. Okay, that's about 86%. Those when people did not get the dime back, get this, 1 out of 25, 4%. Now that's pretty, it's pretty remarkable. And now in an age of cell phones, when you drop your papers, you're certainly not going to get any help on that. I was once talking in a shul some years ago when I was talking about this very point from the pulpit, and guess what happened? My papers fell with the Shabbos, and nobody could help me. That's a true story. I mean, in the end, on this issue of how selfish people are, Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein has written, look, we believe in the Yetzer Hara and we believe in the Yetzer Hatov. There's an evil inclination, there's a good inclination. And he says, man is not inherently good, I'm quoting now, but he is capable of great good, provided he is trained properly. So on this issue, he's saying that Judaism recognizes that there are people who are self-interested, there are people who are altruistic, there are people who are good, and there are people who are bad. Rather than try to force all people into one place, put them in some sort of a cell almost, in which they are doomed to act in accordance with their own self-interest. Okay, having said this, now let's go to the text now. Okay, and here we get to, actually by now we're on to the second of the three topics that I have, the subtopics that I have here. Something I should just mention, the word altruism has been around a lot lately because of the notion of effective altruism. And one of the components of effective altruism, as you know, has gotten himself into some quite a bit of legal trouble. In any case, getting back to this, what I want to talk about here is religious motivation, the motivation for doing religious acts. Now, in theory, before you even get to the text, it would seem that there are at least 5 possible motivations somebody might have for doing an act, for performing a moral act. One is, I am performing this moral act, for example, I'm giving tzedakah, I'm rescuing my friend, I'm visiting a sick person, I'm trying to make the chassan and kala happy. I'm doing that because it's a command of God. Okay, that's one option. Second option, you're doing it because there'll be a reward for doing it, right, from God, or because you're trying to avoid a punishment that will come if you don't do it. So we have command of God, self-interest. A third is that you believe, from your own philosophical reflection, from a humanistic point of view, that that it's rational for you to perform these acts. You're like the follower of Immanuel Kant, or Lawrence Kohlberg, the psychologist, and you have concluded that reason dictates that you act in this way. Another possibility is sympathy. You simply have sympathy for those who are in need, and therefore you act to relieve their need. A fifth possible motivation, say here the fourth review, command of God, self-interest, reason, and sympathy. And now the last is imitatio Dei, that is, imitating God, since God is compassionate and gracious and so forth. When you do acts of compassion and graciousness, you are imitating God. Or I should say, maybe I like emulating. The word emulating, I think, is a better word. Now, you might be surprised when you ask yourself, well, what motivations do Chazal tell us to have? This is not a simple, straightforward matter. First, let me say something about the idea of the command of God, and this will surface in the text we're going to look at. I mentioned a few weeks ago that there's something odd about a person coming to visit the sick, and then when a friend says, thank you so much, we appreciate you coming, it means so much to me, and then you say, well, of course, Bikur Cholim is a mitzvah. I mean, that is not sort of the right thing to say to the person. And it may not even be the right thing to think about. Yeah, you want to do the mitzvah, but there's got to be a little more to it. Where is the personal connection? And you'll see this point coming out shortly in a quote from Jacob Theo Weinberg, which we also did in week one. What I want to point out, the surprise will come, I think, when you deal with the question of whether self-interest is a legitimate motive. So let's go to the text, okay? Let's go to I think I said that I'll do it a minute ago, but I said something in between. Okay, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, okay, begins, this is a well-known Mishnah, I think I quoted it the first week. Antigonus of Socho received the tradition from Shimon Tzaddik. He would say, do not be like servants who serve the master for the sake of receiving reward. But rather be like servants who serve the master, not for the sake of reward. And let the awe of heaven be upon you. But he doesn't say fear of heaven, because fear would interfere with this idea that you're not supposed to have any ulterior motive. Antigonus is asserting that you should not have any ulterior motive when you do mitzvahs. Nothing. Mitzvahs are not there to serve any human interests. It's like Yeshayahu Leibovitz had said that religion is not God serving man, it's man serving God. God is not going to provide you. It's not that God's not going to provide you, it's that none of that should be part of your consciousness, should not be part of your motivation. Now, I mentioned the first week that, I think we tend to think that Pirkei Avos sort of, everything goes together harmoniously. This may go back to the time when people used to learn Pirkei Avos regularly in shul between Mincha and Ma'ariv, and you find a Mishnah and you talk about how great this Mishnah is, and then a few weeks later you do another Mishnah, which actually may be saying the opposite, but since you only have to deal with the Mishnah that you pick, the contradiction does not come through clearly. This looks to be in contradiction with Antigonus. Okay, could you scroll it down a little bit, Shira? Just a little. Okay. This is from Rebbe. Rebbe says the following. Okay, be as scrupulous in performing a minor mitzvah as in performing a major. Why? You don't know the reward for mitzvahs. So I should do it because I don't know which reward I'm getting, right? Calculate the cost of a mitzvah against this reward, figure out the possible reward, figure out how hard it is for you to do the mitzvah, and then calculate the reward of a sin against its cost. And that's the way you should make decisions. If you talk about ulterior motive, I mean, this is an ulterior motive, but this is what he's counseling you to do. Now you might say, well, isn't this considered lo lishma? This is not for its own sake. Yeah, but maybe if it's a reward that God promised, that's a lot different from doing it because let's say you'll be honored at a dinner or something like that. So it's a calculation and you figure out what to do. And this is the reason you should observe. This is a strictly cost-benefit analysis. Now, look at the next paragraph. He says, ponder three things and you will come in and you will, I'm sorry. I knew there was a word missing from my source sheets and I knew it was the word not, and I thought I'd covered myself, but look what I have here. Ponder three things and you will come into the grip of Avera. Not, it should say, you will not come into the grip of Avera. Know what is above you, a seeing eye, an attentive ear, and all your deeds are recorded in a book. In other words, be scared. Now, this is ulteriority. He is appealing to self-interest, and it looks like this really seems to be contrasted with Antigonus. Now, commentators try to reconcile them, okay, and there are ways to reconcile them. Antigonus is the ideal. Rebbe gets closer to the real. That's a possibility. There are ways to do it, but another way to do it is just to say, look, this is a different perspective. And in fact, Rambam says that Antigonus was right. Antigonus is sort of Rambam's hero, but he says the Chazal chastised him for what he said because what they said, Chachamim hizaharu b'debreichem, that the wise people, you have to watch what you say. And he said they're referring to Antigonus, because what happens is people hear that this is the level you have to be on, that you should not be motivated by reward and punishment at all. Then they're not going to do the mitzvahs because they're going to feel that's beyond them. So in other words, Antigonus spilled some beans that Rambam thought should not have been spilled. At the same time, it's still possible that Rebbe is saying something that needs to be taken into account. Now, what might that be? I mean, your reaction may be, well, why would Rebbe really say such a thing? It sounds so crass. Do it for the sake of reward. I have a thought about this, okay? And the thought is that when you talk about, I will do this because God will reward me or God will punish me, what you are doing is taking the theology of providence seriously. You believe strongly in divine providence. That's why you're thinking about reward. That's why you're thinking about punishment. A person who carries out what Rebbe is saying to carry out, to calculate the cost of a mitzvah against the reward, is a person who believes in Sachar v'Onesh. And that could get lost in Antigonus's formulation. The same way it gets lost with Yeshayahu Leibovitz. Because the whole point is that, again, religion is not God serving man, it's man serving God. Oh, it's not God serving man. So I can put aside anything that God does for me. And you lose a lot when you don't see providence. You lose, for example, a sense of gratitude or appreciation or love of God. And maybe that could be the basis for a position like Rebbe's that sort of validates the use of self-interest as religious motivation. Now, the quote from Leibovitz is very similar to Antigonus. I read it to you a couple of weeks ago. That there's no such verse says you should love your neighbor as yourself. It's love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord your God. As meaning, don't love your neighbor for humanitarian reasons. Love your neighbor because God wants you to do it, and that's it. No thought of reward, no thought of punishment, no humanitarianism. This is what you should do because God commanded it. I am the Lord your God. That's the whole pasuk. Love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord your God. It's not the whole pasuk; it's the whole part of the pasuk. Now, Rambam actually did follow Antigonus with a difference when he speaks in Hilchos Tshuva, in the last paragraph of Hilchos Tshuva, about worshiping God from love. He says, one who worships God from love occupies himself with Torah study and with doing mitzvahs and walks in the ways of wisdom, not because of any worldly gain, not because he fears evil, can scroll down, and not in order to inherit the good. Instead, now what he says is, Oseho emes mipnei shehu emes. He does the true, and I put in brackets the right, because I think that he's really talking about right or wrong, because it is true, all right, and the good will ultimately come from it. Now, this is also, an attack on ulterior motivation. Okay, he's lauding the idea of what he called avodah me'ahava, that you should act not for the sake of any reward, not even to get into a law. He includes that here, and it's very similar to Antigonus, but with a difference. Antigonus just said, submit. That's it. God commands, submit. Rambam is saying, not a question of submission. It's a question of doing what you do for a particular reason. It's because you recognize its truth. You recognize its rightness. That's my reading of it. Now, the person is supposed to think about the mitzvahs, but it's supposed to think how great they are. I have reasons for saying this that are based on things Rambam says elsewhere, but that's my general reading. What I want to next show you, though, is what I said before about reward and punishment being important. Isaac Abarbanel, okay, the Abarbanel in Nachlas Avos, which is his commentary on Pirkei Avos, has a remarkable section in which he attacks the idea of avodah me'ahava, and he says, "Kimu v'kiblu," meaning the Jewish philosophers accepted. That's a phrase, of course, from the Megillah. They accepted that what Chazal meant by avodah lishma is what they described. Listen to Abarbanel. Heaven forbid that we should think this. Okay, Chalila, that we should think the way Rambam is thinking about this. He says, but because, this is the point I made before, because the philosophers did not accept belief in divine providence, and they denied reward and punishment according to deeds. They didn't believe in Sachar v'Onesh. They saw no purpose in actions except the action itself. That's why they had the idea of the action being valuable in itself, because they didn't realize that there can be rationales for the action based on reward and punishment. They didn't understand that. But we who believe in providence, and I just wrote ... because I don't even have to finish the sentence there. We who believe in providence obviously have another reason for doing these mitzvahs. Now, I want to be clear here. I want to mention that I think the Abarbanel here is talking really about the ritual mitzvahs. He has less of a disagreement with Rambam about the interpersonal one, and the real disagreement seems to come, for example, putting on tefillin and so forth, to do it for the sake of reward. So here you see two perspectives, Antigonus versus Rebbe, and then you see the same two perspectives in Rambam versus Abarbanel. On the one hand, getting rid of any ulterior motivation, okay, that seems to be good. We look at that, wow, that's great. You're not thinking of anything, you're not thinking of God as serving you. But on the other hand, you also lose that sense of reward and punishment. And I think that both perspectives have a certain validity, and maybe we even get caught between these two perspectives. You could argue there's a higher and a lower, but it's really not clear to me why the higher should exclude the reward and punishment aspect. And that's it. It's not that you can't believe in the reward and punishment, of course. That to be clear here again. It's not that you can't believe in reward and punishment if you believe that submission is the key. You can believe in it, but it doesn't motivate you. But still, I think it gets put off to the side. It gets put much more on the margins when that's the mentality. So I think that these are the two perspectives. Now, I want to now show you a couple of places in the Gemara where the Gemara again validates the self-interest. Here is a brisa that says, "So stuck up one says this coin goes to tzedakah, so my son will live. Okay, he's giving the tzedakah for an ulterior motive. He is a complete tzaddik. Now that's a very striking phrase. Why he's called a complete tzaddik, but you can understand it possibly in terms of his having this strong concept of sachar ba'onesh. That's one way to do it. I've also heard it said that maybe the correct text is tzedakah gemura, which would mean it's a complete act of tzedakah. In other words, it's not a deficient act. It's not a deficient act of charity. But look what this is doing. It's validating self-interest. Moed Katan, this is now an explanation of laws concerning the dead. A brisa teaches, if one eulogizes the dead, he will be eulogized. If one buries the dead, he will be buried. If one carries the dead, he will be carried. If one raises himself for the dead, he will be raised. In other words, what he's telling you is the importance of eulogizing, the importance of burying the dead, the importance of carrying the dead, the importance of raising yourself for the dead. But what is the importance here? Well, the importance is what it does for you. But there is a bit of an ambiguity in Rabbi Meir. It's not clear whether Rabbi Meir is saying this is the way of the world. In other words, people who eulogize the dead will themselves be eulogized. It's like, or buries the dead, they'll be buried. You know, it very often happens, for example, that a person goes to Menachem Avos, goes to a Shiva call, and then the next time with that person, God forbid, is sitting Shiva, the person to whom he or she went comes, even if that person is not particularly close to the person who's now sitting Shiva. In other words, there's a certain reciprocity that takes place, a reciprocal dynamic here. And but that's what everybody was saying. That's the way. If you want people to do things for you later, you should do it that way. But he also, I think, he's describing the way of the world. This is the way of the world, and it can be a motivator. Once again, self-interest is the motive. A person who was very interested in this idea was Rabbi Soloveitchik. He showed, first of all, he said, and this is a very commonsensical point, and Rabbi Sacks makes the same point somewhere, that, look, when it comes to charity, when it comes to things that have such social benefit to people, you can't be so exacting about motive. The outcome is very important and not just the motivation. You're not going to stifle the outcome just because you think the person has an ulterior motivation. There are times when you get stuck if the person doesn't really need it. So there are discussions in halacha about whether or not that fulfills an act of tzedakah, when it fulfills it, doesn't fulfill it. But overall, it's clear that tzedakah as an institution can work only if it's result oriented. But the Rav makes a different point here as well. He says, compliant, and that is that he's trying to say that this idea of self-interest involves a very deeply seated understanding of what a human being is and of human nature. In general, as I read this, you'll see, the Rav believed that our biology affects us a great deal. At the same time, we are not its prisoners. There is room for free will, but we also cannot avoid biological influences. We can't jump out of our own skin. Let's read this. Compliance with the principle of chesed is not only mandatory, but useful as well with respect to the furtherance of our own good. That's what Rabbi Sacks is saying, right? There's tremendous value for you. Um, Judaism has never felt embarrassed by this utilitarian motif. If and when it helps man to reach the ethical decision, it did not divorce the ethical motif from the human being's utilitarian nature. We are by nature result oriented. We are by nature subject to a cost benefit calculus. We do want results. The compulsive power of the norm, he says about 2 lines later, have not been diminished in any way because of the fact that the fulfillment of the moral law aims at the promotion of the interest of the doer and is found to be useful. There's no diminution, he's saying, of the compulsive power of the norm. The halacha is still there, even if the person gets a personal benefit out of doing it. It is honorable and moral to serve others while I desire my own good and happiness. There's no shame in it. There's no shame in feeling that you are benefiting from the act that you do. You know, Rabbi Sacks at times mentions studies that show, and this is again related to the quote that Dr. Weiss began with, is that is that when you give charity, you feel good. Doing good deeds makes you feel good. And very, very important idea. And the Rebbe is saying there's nothing wrong with arguing that way. He's not addressing Rebbe Sacks directly, but the point is, this, I think, underscores here what the Rebbe is saying, that these acts contribute to our happiness. Now look at the last paragraph of the Rebbe. Man was not provided with independence at the hour of creation. A person was not independent of the hour of creation. The Creator willed man to feel helpless while in seclusion and to be constantly in need of companionship. The human being was created, but the human being couldn't do it all himself. The human being, Eselo Ezer Kenegdo, God creates a companion. And in addition to that, he quotes from Koheles, Tovim Hashnayim Mino Echad, that two are better than one, because if one falters, the other one will pick up the work. The Rav believes that this is why, I think that this is why self-interest is counted. It doesn't mean it's the highest ideal. It's not the highest ideal, but it's still something that the Rav believes is related to who we are, what we are as human beings, and it's something we don't have to be ashamed of indulging in. So if a person says that this selah, this coin is b'shvil yechiyadani, so my son will live, this is not something for him to be embarrassed about. Now, though, I want to look at I mentioned before when I started this section, I said that there was a bunch of possible reasons, and I mentioned the command of God, I mentioned self-interest, I mentioned reason, I mentioned sympathy, I mentioned imitatio Dei, which I have not touched on yet. But this is a passage we read the first time, that is in the first session, but now I'm giving it a little bit more weight. This is the one that tells you that the command of God should not be central in what you do. It's a tshuva about ironically in the days right after Purim, about Mishloach Manot that was in a tshuva of Rabbi Yaakov Yechiel Weinberg in his Tzarei Eish. It's better that a person gives of his own free will out of a feeling of love for his brother. If he gives only because God so commanded, he diminishes the nature of love. If you give Shalach Manos only because you were commanded to, then you're not doing it with sufficient love. Likewise with tzedakah. If he gives from Rachamim or love of the Israelite, that's better than one who gives because of a command or coercion. Now notice he says if he gives only because God so commanded, okay, so it's not clear whether he's allowing for the possibility that God doesn't, that the command should not be on your mind at all, okay, but this is certainly an interesting claim, and it's very different from the idea of doing out of self-interest. So we've seen the command of God reflected on Tignis and Yishai La'ivovitz. We've seen self-interest reflected in quite a number of the sources that we did. I haven't done anything that involves reason, but now we see something that involves sympathy or emotion. And now we move on to the third and final leg of the talk, which I hope doesn't mean that the talk is on its last legs, but here's what I want to discuss. I want to discuss here, I called the section As Thyself, the Scope and Limits of Altruism. It's got the question mark, As Thyself, the Scope and Limits of Altruism. And underneath I wrote, Ahavta Re'echa Kamo. And there are only 3 questions about Ahavta Re'echa Kamo. One is, what does the Ahavta mean? What does L'Reacha mean? And what does Kamocha mean? Does Ahavta mean emotional love? Does it mean behavioral expressions of love? Do you have to have you love at all? Who is Reacha? Is Reacha the person who is next door neighbor? Is Reacha your another Jew? Is it another observant Jew? All these things are discussed in halacha. I'm not going to deal with that, although I have to say, if I may just throw in something about the whether it's emotional or behavioral. People sometimes say, well, it's got to be behavioral because you can't command emotions. That's not something the Rav believes. The Rav very vigorously believes you can command emotions. Here is a kind of laundry list of places where you are commanded to have emotions. Love of God, love of the stranger. And of course, you could reduce those to behavior too, but I think it's a little harder. Right before you have the idea that you can't hate your brother in your heart. That's a command to your emotion, clearly to your emotion. Respecting your parents, fearing your parents. Festival rejoicing. Mourning, okay, which is rabbinic rather than biblical, but still it makes the point. And then when you give charity, you must not, feel begrudging when you give it. Those are commands to emotions. I think that establishes pretty clearly that the Ahafza here is emotional, maybe plus behavioral. It doesn't rule out behavioral, but I think it doesn't make sense to leave it out. I think, by the way, that Nachmanides also believed that it's emotional, but he has been cast in the literature as believing it's behavioral, and I think that his comments actually show otherwise. But having said that, let's now take a look at the source sheet and see what we can do with it. Okay, so if you can just put up the sources, the last part. Okay, now the first issue we'll discuss is what komocha means. Okay, what does it mean to love your neighbor as thyself? Okay, now this famous story in Masechah Shabbos, there was an incident involving, I was reading, a certain Gentile who came before Shammai and said, "Convert me on the condition you'll teach me the entire Torah while I stand on one foot. Teach me the whole Torah al regel achas." The point I've seen made originally by Professor Warren Zev Harvey that in Latin the word for a rule is regular. So standing on one foot could be al regel achas, could mean standing on one rule, which makes a lot of sense as you keep reading, because Hillel gave him one rule. Anyway, put that aside. Shammai pushed him away with a ruler, ironically, a ruler he was holding. The Gentile then came before Hillel, and Hillel converted him. Hillel said, okay, here's the rule. You want to know the rule? That which is hateful to you, do not do unto your fellow. This is the entire Torah. The rest is commentary, go learn. Like Alfred North Whitehead said about Plato, that all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. The rest is commentary. It's often been noted that Hillel here gives his formulation in the negative. He doesn't say that which you want, you must do to your fellow. He said that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. And one reason that's been suggested as to why he does that is that he thinks that if you demanded that you do for the other person what you want, then what if you have extravagant needs? Okay, does that obligate you to then give them to the other person? Secondly, if you have minuscule needs, okay, if there's very little that you want, I shouldn't say needs, I should say desires. If you have minuscule desires, then you do with the other person what's minuscule, and that's why it's framed in the negative. The problem is that I think that that's going to happen anyway, because if the rule is that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. I mean, so think of a person who doesn't mind being insulted, doesn't mind being screamed at. I mean, I know people who love to be screamed at. They love to be the center of attention. So if you don't mind being screamed at, so it's not hateful to you, so it's okay then for you to scream at your neighbor. It doesn't seem to make sense. This is a problem with kamocha. It's a problem with using kamocha as a constraint on when you are obligated. Similar point in the next source. I should say sources, because there's a text found in Bereshis Rabbah, Nedarim, and Sifra Kadoshim, which they sound very similar, but the problem is it doesn't make sense in certain formulations. So Rav David Tzvi Hoffman and then later some other scholars discussed how this could possibly work. So instead of writing a Hebrew text, which doesn't really exist for this, I'm going to read it to you. Rabbi Akiva says, "Love your neighbor as thyself" is a great principle of the Torah. Okay, now, as you know, that turned into a song. Ben Azai says, God created man in his likeness, but musel kimasel. So that's a greater principle. So you should not say, since I've been humiliated, my friend should be as well. Or since I've been cursed, he should be as well. Meaning, listen, Rabbi Akiva, if I follow you, that's v'haparecha kamocha, then what's going to happen if I've been humiliated? I can humiliate my friend. And if I've been cursed, then I could, according to you, curse him as well. And Rabbi Tanchuma then explains that if you've done so, in other words, if you cursed your friend, you humiliated your friend, know whom you have abused. You created, you abused the demus of God. Now, Ben Azai's argument here seems to not represent Rabbi Akiva's view in the way it should be, the way he probably meant it. Since I've been humiliated, my friend should be as well. This makes it sound as if Rabbi Akiva is advocating two wrongs make a right. In both examples, since I've been cursed, he should be as well. As if, Rabbi Akiva says kamocha, so two wrongs make a right. It doesn't seem to be what Rabbi Akiva meant. What Rabbi Akiva meant is that if you desire something, you should do it for your friend as well. That seems to be why love your neighbor as yourself is a great principle of the Torah. Ben Azai's objection doesn't seem to be correct. But again, if let's say you say that, let's say you straighten it out and you say that what Rabbi Akiva meant is that you should desire for your friend, or you should do for your friend all the things that you want done unto you. You get to the same problem we had before, which is that if I have extravagant needs, then I become obligated to be extravagant to my neighbor. And if I have minuscule needs, then I have no obligation to give anything more than minuscule to my neighbor. So again, kamocha, if you use kamocha as a measure, it's very difficult to apply it in a way that is really consistent and coherent. It's been suggested by Moses Mendelssohn, actually, that kamocha here should be understood as it is in a different verse about the stranger, va'ahavta lo kamocha, which Mendelssohn understands as you should love him because he is kamocha, he is like you. So you're appealing to the common humanity and the common experience, actually, the common experience of the stranger and your experience in Egypt, and that could be applied here. And the Chama Leibovitz, I think, quotes this with favor. I know she quotes it. So that's a very interesting idea. But I want you to see here that kamocha does present certain logical issues, and becomes very difficult to define exactly what your obligations are. Now, I want to now point out, though, to something else, and that is, I mentioned before, imitatio Dei, the role of imitating God in doing chesed. There was a very fascinating article by Rav Aaron Lichtenstein, which is about the following case. Suppose you have a person who is in need of funds, is in need of tzedakah, but this person could be working and isn't working. The reason he has no money is because he hasn't taken the initiative to get a job, and he could get a job. I understand that, in our society, you can't necessarily assume that, but suppose it's a situation where you can't assume that. So Rav Lichtenstein points out, and this is something that really deserves to be set up front here, is that the obligation of chesed has two components. One is v'ahavta l'recha kamocha. You should love your neighbor as thyself. The other is imitating God. Rav Lichtenstein's position is that from the point of view of v'ahavta l'recha kamocha, there are complexities, there are qualifications, there are limitations on when the obligation applies, and it very well might not apply to this kind of situation where you could be giving the money to someone else who actually, is trying to extricate himself from a bad situation, as opposed to this person who isn't trying to extricate himself from a bad situation. Your funds are sort of getting diverted in the wrong direction. So maybe from the point of view of v'ahavta kamocha, you don't have to give. But from the point of view of imitatio Dei, you do. Now, why? If you just go a little further up here too. Okay, look at this quote. Two quotes very similar in their intent. Brachos 7a. Right? What does God say to Moshe? He says, "I shall be gracious to those to whom I shall be gracious." Afal pisha ain't no good. We're told, even if he's not worthy. Now, in context, that's a way of sort of telling Moshe, "Don't ask me any questions about why I give rewards and punishments the way I do. Okay, but here, focusing just on this phrase, the point is that God's attributes include giving to people who, even if they're not worthy, and the sentence, the line there continued with rachamim also. Correlated with this is a text in the Sifrei, the Medrash on Parshas Eikev. Hakadosh Baruch Hu nikra Chanun. He's called Chanun. Afa toheye Chanun. Okay, you too should be Chanun without your day. Say matnas chinam, perhaps matnos chinam, that you should give gifts gratuitously. Give gratuitous gifts. Now, what does that mean? That means that it's similar to the idea in the previous quote, that God will be gracious even to those who don't deserve it. God will be compassionate even to those who don't deserve it. And God gives gratuitous gifts. I suppose that could be a gratuitous gift, God extending the compassion to that person. So Rabbi Lichtenstein explains, look at the quote here. He says, not with calculated and planned steps, and not out of considerations of reciprocity and mutuality, agreement and parallelism, does man walk in the footsteps of the Creator. It's not a matter of walking in, if you're walking in the footsteps of the Creator, as opposed to following the Ahav L'Recha, then you're not considering reciprocity, you're not considering mutuality, you're not really doing all of these calculated and planned steps, but precisely with acts of kindness that breach the dams of balance and reckoning. You're getting away from all that balance, getting away from all that reckoning. Now, so it seems that from the point of view of Ahav L'Recha Kamocha, you may not have to give to this person I mentioned, who could be working and isn't. From the point of view of Metatio Dei, it looks like you should. Now, in the end, this consideration is not decisive for Rav Lichtenstein. He tends more to, he moves more toward the other side. But it's important to see this difference. And there's a philosopher who wrote the following work. He was talking about virtues. And, and he wanted to say that very often when a person has a virtue, it spills over elsewhere, spills over into other areas. And the quote is, virtue does not finally, I'm misquoting it a drop, I quoted in my writing a lot of times, exactly how it goes. Virtue is not subject to very fine discriminations. Meaning, if a person is virtuous, the person carries over that virtue even to situations in which it may not be technically even called for. Okay, but that's simply the way it is. A person can't help himself from doing certain things, even when maybe even they're questionable, or certainly when they're not obligated. And this idea here of the Metatio Dei is not paying attention to these calculations, but instead the virtue should spill over. Again, this is not where Wittgenstein ends up, but it's a very important idea. This brings me now to one of the most famous cases in the, if we can go back to the screen, the most famous case probably, well, I'm going to skip the one in Subis for lack of time here. This is going to involve, and this is something that Dr. Weiss mentioned at the beginning, the idea, the idea of self-sacrifice. And essentially in halacha, there are a couple of different cases that deal with self-sacrifice. One is rescues. Now, rescue can take in a lot. It can take in the idea of giving an organ to someone, help the person live. It can include allowing yourself to be experimented on for the sake of promoting knowledge. It can be performing a rescue mission during the war, as happened. And there is some Shatz about that. I can send you to an interesting tshuva that's included in the book by Rabbi Lamb called The Good Society, a little anthology edited by Rabbi Lamb called The Good Society. There are many such questions. And basically those, to put it very roughly, this idea of a three-tiered approach. There's one type of approach where the risk is so great that you're not allowed to do it. There's another one approach, not approach, one level or one kind of situation where you are not, where you're not allowed to do it because the risk is too great. There's another where it's a minimal risk and you can't avoid it. And then there's a huge middle ground where you have a certain choice, where it is your choice whether to do it. Now, there's some question about whether a person could actually violate if the person is in the case where it's very risky and ordinarily too risky to carry out, can the person sort of go ahead and do it anyway? That I'm not going to get into that fine. I just want to mention the three-tiered approach. But I do want to look at this case. There are people who have never heard about any case in the Talmud except for this case. Because it's very, very famous. It actually comes from a situation described by the Stoics. It's a different situation. Two are traveling and one has a flask of water. If both drink, they both die. Only one drinks, he reaches an inhabited area. Along comes a mysterious figure named Ben Petura. Some might think he's identified with a Christian figure. There's a lot of discussion about this. Better that they both drink and die, and neither has to watch the death of the other. But he wants that both should drink and both should die. That way, nobody has to watch the other one die, and actually, no one has to be the cause of the other one dying. I had, the thought has occurred that Petura might be related to Petira or death. That Petura could be son of death. So that's why he says they both drink. That's why he's related to this position that he takes. But anyway, until Rabbi Akiva came and taught, your brother should live with you. Your life takes precedence over your conscience. Now, that pasuk, is not dealing with this kind of dire situation. It's just about helping somebody in other ways. And here's the way Rabbi Akiva is reading the verse, though. Your brother should live with you. Your brother should live with you. Meaning, if you can't live, your obligation of the Achicha falls away. You are limited by the idea of imach. Imach is a constraint, it's a limitation on when you have the obligation to make your brother live. Interestingly, in the parallel text in the Medrash and in the Sifra, then Petura, he takes the same position he takes here, but he gives a different reason. He actually uses the same pasuk. He says, what it means is, your brother, the imach, meaning the two of you have to have the same fate. If he dies, you got to die also. But Rabbi Akiva, of course, is the position that that comes through and is accepted. Okay, your life takes precedence over your comments. It's not that easy to see exactly how this position is developed. It looks to us on the surface when you first see it, okay, that this is a principle of partiality. Meaning, it's the principle that you can be partial to yourself, okay, which is a position a lot of philosophers take, who have different philosophical positions about what's right and wrong, but they take it about themselves that they can make an exception, for themselves. That's what it looks like. However, when you look at the way in which Ba'alei Halacha, the Halachas, have approached this particular topic, you see that they actually look at it as many look at it as a principle of impartiality. For example, here's one way to get to impartiality. There is a principle, I call this the least change principle. Okay, what I mean is this: when you have a dire situation, okay, not a situation in which you can just do active things without hurting people, but when you have a dire situation, and you have to choose between lives, how do you make the choice? Answer, according to this principle, least change. The less change that you make in the situation, the better. I own the resource, and I'm assuming that the word biyad here means to own, okay, rather than just to have it physically. If you transfer it to the other person, then that's a bigger change than if you keep it for yourself. The only action you really do is to drink it, okay? But it's really kind of yours because that's the situation you started. This could be because of divine providence, God arranged the situation this way, but you kind of leave it alone to the extent you can, which again doesn't rule out any kind of aggressive action in other situations. Another example of an impartialist reading of this text is, I have the canteen, right? So now the question is, let's say you rule out the possibility of my depriving the other person living, why should two people die if you can get by with one person dying? So then the question is, who is it, him or me? Transferring the canteen does nothing in this line of reasoning. Because what you do is you transfer the canteen, and then what have you done? Exact same situation you started with. Two people are traveling, and one of them has a flask. It's exactly the same situation. So then that person would have to give it back to me. And then I would have to give it back to that person, because we're still in that same situation where one person has the flask. And this would go on infinitely. So it makes more sense is that the person who has it stays with it. That's another example of an impartialist reading the text. This would explain also very well the difference between chayecha kodmi and chayecha verecha, that your life takes priority, and the rule that you're not allowed to kill somebody to save yourself. In the case where you threaten, kill X or I'll kill you, the big change would be to kill that person. Here, the big change would be to transfer it. And so the rules work out, the cases work out in a very consistent fashion. That would be the impartialist rule. So now comes the following question. It's an important consideration. What happens if I have the canteen and now I feel I just can't bear to watch my friend wither away, die? I can't bear it. It's too hard for me. I love my friend too much. I have a lot of compassion. Can I transfer the canteen? Well, if this is an impartialist principle, if this is a principle that says, look, not looking at as you're more important than him, not looking at it that way, but looking at it as this is the way you figure out what the halacha is, then I can't change it. I mean, I can't go against I can't go against the halacha here. The way the rules work out for who should keep it, okay, I can't violate the least change principle. I can't try to create this infinite regress and so forth. So, okay, so then it seems that in that case, I'm not allowed to transfer. On the other hand, and many halachas say you can't transfer it, which is really striking considering that we are, in Western society especially, we are sort of raised in the idea that altruism or giving up your life for someone else is the paramount act of virtue. In the Tale of Two Cities, in the Christian Bible, you have the idea, "If greater love hath no man than to give his life for another." Here, it's very striking that you would not be allowed. On the other hand, there are those who regard this as hamidas chasidus, the pious thing to do. You're not obligated to give it over to the other person, but a really good person will give it over. How do you explain this? I mean, it seems like wild that you have these two extremes. Either it's usser or it's a great act of piety. I think it depends how you're looking at it. If you look at this situation in terms of the rules, so the rules lead you to the conclusion that the person who has the canteen ought to keep it, for reasons we gave, especially if you look at the least change principle. On the other hand, if you look at this in terms of character, like we mentioned before, you look at this in terms of virtue, okay? If that's the way you look at it, then it looks very different. Because the person who wants to give the canteen to the other person is a person of deep empathy, deep compassion, deep love. So if you evaluate what to do from the point of view of the virtue of the agent's character, then the person can become a chassid, he can become a truly pious person by giving it over. And so this question of whether to give it over, whether you're allowed to give it over or not allowed to give it over, becomes a question of whether you're looking sort of at the rules and the way the rules develop, or whether you're looking at character. Very similar to what we had before. And let me just give you one more example of this, and then if I can just hold you another 2-3 minutes, say something about Rabbi Sacks. This is a different case here, which is going to illustrate a similar point about virtue versus a technicality. This is a case, many of you know this kind of situation where non-Jews surround a Jewish city and they say, hand over someone to us, and if not, we'll destroy the city. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who occupied a good position there, an important position, went up, he persuaded the person to submit, and he gave him up, because that was the teaching that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi believed prevailed. Okay, that was the teaching. Eliyahu had been in the habit of visiting Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and now he stopped visiting. Rabbi Yeshua fasted several fasts, and Elijah finally appeared to him and said, listen, the reason I didn't appear to you, Yeshua and Rabbi Yeshua basically saying, where are you? Where were you? Shall I reveal myself to informers or to betrayers? Rabbi Yeshua said, have I not carried out a Mishnah? Didn't I follow what the teaching was? And Elijah replied, is this a Mishnah Hasidim, a teaching for the pious? In other words, in terms of character, you should not have done this. And then I wrote here underneath, the story also appears, you just scroll it down a little more. also appears in Bereshis Rabbah with some differences. There, the closing line is Elijah replied, "Is this the Mishnas Hasidim, a teaching for the pious?" And then some more words. This should have been done through others, not by you yourself. You are too important a person, you are too saintly a person to give someone over. Better this be done by someone else. There are some analogs to this. I don't have the time to go into it, involving some responses during the Holocaust. But I'm really running out of time, and I appreciate you being here. I don't want to keep you too long. And the last two sources I have there, if you just scroll down, I'm sure the last two have to do with something else, and that's the question of prioritization, whether you can prioritize your own community. And there are two texts here. One says that if there's a spring that belongs to residents of the city, so then those people have priority, not only with respect to life, but even according to one view, Rabbi Yossi, the laundering of the city takes priority over the lives of the people in the other city. But either way, it's your water. And the last one is about your poor takes precedence over the poor of your city. The poor of your city takes precedence over the poor of another city. And I could have also listed here some sources which say that when it deals with the redeeming captives or giving tzedakah, you have to prioritize your own family, those who are closest to you. Why? And here's where I want to just bring in Rabbi Sacks for a final couple of minutes. I finished the last two times, exactly on time. So let me just say this. I'm going to read you something about Rabbi Sacks that I think is sort of typical of the way he thought about this. It is sort of puzzling, because why should I prioritize my own? Why don't I just treat everybody the same? Shouldn't I be loving everybody? And here's what he writes. It says, the universality of moral concern is not something you learn by being universal, but by being particular. We come to care about other people, not by thinking global terms, but by thinking about those whom we know. Because we know what it is to be a parent loving our children, not children in general, but our own children. We understand what it is for someone else to be a parent, loving his or her children, not ours. There is no road to human solidarity that does not begin with moral particularity. No road to human solidarity that does not begin with moral particularity. By coming to know what it means to be a child, a parent, a neighbor, a friend, we learn to love humanity by having specific human beings. There is no shortcut. As another writer I know, Ira Mintz, wrote, when Chesed, he wrote, when Chesed begins at home, it doesn't end there. And that was, I think, one of the ideas of Rabbi Sacks. Where does this leave us? Well, this leaves us with the idea that we can prioritize our own. We discussed this a bit with respect to the canteen case and other cases, but we do it in the aim, according to him, of a universal goal. But may I just be Messiah, just close with another statement by Rabbi Sacks that reflects some thoughts I have about what he was trying to do. And he gets across the following theme. And here I'm looking at his book, Essays on Ethics. The moral system initiated by the Torah, honed and refined by the oral tradition, and more than 3,000 years of reflection and elucidation, remains our greatest heritage of wisdom and insight into the human condition under the sovereignty of God. And his challenge remains, God's challenge, become his partner in the work of creation and healing the wounds of a fractured world. So thank you all very much. Thank you for your interest. And I wish you, well, I guess I can wish you a happy Pesach by now. Okay. Be well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shatz, for your keen insight and analyses over these past 3 weeks. I speak on behalf of many of your students who are on here tonight and who will be watching the recordings, that it's really, really a true pleasure to be back in your philosophy classroom as you help us navigate these really challenging ethical quandaries. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we invite you to join us at our next virtual learning opportunity on Tuesday, April 16th, when we will be exploring Haggadah highlights. Thanks a lot. We look forward to seeing you then. Have a good night.